The charity gala sparkled with champagne and calculated conversations. For Marcus Chin, it was just another obligation in a life built on duty. He adjusted his ill-fitting rental tuxedo, feeling the weight of curious stares on his nurse's salary attempt at black tie attire. His best friend from medical school had insisted he attend. She'd become chief of cardiology at this very hospital and needed moral support. But standing alone beside an ice sculpture, Marcus felt less like a guest and more like a museum curiosity on display. Across the marble foyer, Dr. Helena Ashford felt trapped in her own gilded cage. She was cornered by her father, a formidable patriarch whose pharmaceutical empire had built this hospital wing. He gestured pointedly toward a man with perfect teeth and an equally perfect trust fund. "He's ideal, Helena," her father whispered beneath the quartet's melody. "His venture capital connections could revolutionize our expansion plans. Stop wasting time and settle down with someone who understands our world." Helena's shoulders tensed. Since her catastrophic engagement had imploded 2 years ago, her father's matchmaking had become relentless. She felt like a prize mare being shown at auction. Her gaze swept the ballroom, seeking escape, and locked onto his. She saw a man across the room looking as uncomfortable as she felt. He was handsome in an understated way, with warm brown eyes that currently reflected a mixture of embarrassment and quiet dignity. She watched as a woman dripping in diamonds and condescension approached him. "I don't believe we've been introduced," the woman said, eyeing Marcus with undisguised disdain. "You must be with the catering service. Be a dear and refresh my champagne?" The insult landed like a slap. Marcus's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping his water glass until his knuckles went pale. He was about to excuse himself, his pride shattered. In that instant, Helena saw her opportunity. It was reckless, desperate, born from her own suffocation and an inexplicable urge to rescue the man with the wounded dignity in his eyes. She excused herself from her father with a curt word, leaving him mid-sentence, and crossed the ballroom with the purposeful stride of a surgeon approaching an emergency case. The crowd parted for her. She didn't stop until she stood beside Marcus. She completely ignored the insulting guest, her entire focus on him. She leaned in, her voice a low conspiratorial whisper meant for his ears alone. "Pretend to be my husband." Marcus stared at her, his mind spinning. It was Dr. Helena Ashford, the billionaire cardiac surgeon, a woman he'd only seen from a distance during hospital rounds. "What?" he breathed. "Play along," she murmured, her blue eyes glinting with dangerous, thrilling determination. "I'll make it worth your while." Before he could protest, she took his hand, her grip warm and surprisingly gentle. She turned to face her stunned father and the approaching venture capitalist, pulling Marcus close to her side. "Father," she said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'd like you to finally meet my husband, Marcus. We were hoping to keep it private a bit longer, but I suppose there's no better time than now." A collective gasp rippled through the immediate crowd. The woman who had insulted him stood frozen, her mouth agape. Helena's father looked as though he'd been struck. Helena smiled, a dazzling, confident smile that was pure performance. She brought Marcus's hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles, her eyes never leaving his. "Darling," she said, her voice a low caress. "I believe they're playing our song." For the rest of the evening, they were a whirlwind of convincing fiction. She never left his side, her hand always resting on his arm, a gesture of possessive intimacy that sent electricity through his nervous system. She whispered witty observations in his ear that made him laugh, a real, genuine laugh that surprised them both. They danced, and in her arms he felt a sense of safety and belonging that was utterly intoxicating. The chemistry between them was a palpable electric current, confusing and thrilling them in equal measure. At the end of the night, she escorted him to the hotel's grand entrance, away from prying eyes. The fantasy was fading. "You were convincing," she said, her voice returning to its cool, professional tone, though her eyes still held warmth. "You're not a bad actor yourself, Doctor," he replied, his heart still racing. She reached into her clutch and handed him a slim white business card. "I'll be in touch," she said. And with that, She turned and disappeared into a waiting black car, leaving him standing on the curb. The cool night air stark against the heat that still lingered on his skin where she had touched him. He looked down at the card in his hand, his mind spinning. What had just happened? The week after the gala was a return to the harsh fluorescent reality of Marcus's life. The memory of the glittering ballroom, of Helena's hand in his, felt like a dream. He worked double shifts at the hospital, the scent of antiseptic and exhaustion replacing the memory of her perfume. His younger sister had been diagnosed with lupus 6 months ago, and the medical bills were crushing. Each new statement was a fresh weight threatening to drown them both. He was in the middle of checking vitals during the evening shift when the ward fell silent. It was the same phenomenon he'd witnessed at the gala, the sudden collective hush that announced her arrival. Dr. Helena Ashford stood at the nurse's station, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that made her look like a queen surveying her domain. Her eyes scanned the area, bypassing the starstruck staff, and landed directly on him. She walked to him, her presence so commanding it seemed to charge the air. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice a low, calm command that cut through the ward's ambient noise. "I believe we have matters to discuss." She waited while he handed off his clipboard to a wide-eyed colleague, then led him to a private consultation room. She didn't waste a moment on pleasantries. "I've taken the liberty of reviewing your situation," she began, her tone crisp and clinical. It was a chillingly casual admission of her resources. "Your sister's systemic lupus, the mounting debt from her treatments, your 2 jobs that still aren't covering the cost of her biologic medications." She laid out the grim reality of his life as if reading from a medical chart. Marcus felt a flush of shame, of anger. She was dissecting his desperation. "I'm proposing a formal arrangement," she continued, her blue eyes intense and analytical. "A 1-year contract. You'll perform the duties of my husband in public-facing situations. You'll attend corporate events and social functions. You'll maintain the illusion we created at the gala." She paused, letting the weight of her next words sink in. "In exchange, I will settle every one of your family's debts immediately. Furthermore, your sister will be transferred to a private room here at Ashford Memorial. She'll be under the care of the best rheumatology and nephrology team in the country. Every test, every procedure, every medication, all covered. She'll want for nothing." It was a miracle. A lifeline thrown into drowning waters. It was everything he'd been praying for. But he knew there was a catch. A woman like Helena Ashford did nothing without reason, without protection. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" "You're pragmatic," she stated simply. "You're intelligent, composed under pressure, and you have clear, powerful motivation to fulfill this contract. You're a predictable variable." She leaned forward slightly. "And because my last relationship taught me a valuable lesson, love is a liability. Emotions are variables I won't entertain again." She slid a sleek tablet across the table. "The contract is all here." His hands trembled as he took it. He scrolled through the dense legal language, the non-disclosure agreements, the appearance schedules. Then he saw it. He read it, his blood running cold. The clause stipulated in clear legal terms that the contract was contingent on the relationship remaining purely transactional. If either party developed genuine romantic feelings for the other, they were contractually obligated to confess immediately. Upon confession, the contract would be terminated. All future benefits, including ongoing medical care, would cease. It was a trap. A beautifully engineered trap. She'd created a game where the only way to win was to lie. But she, a woman who valued honesty, had made truthfulness a requirement. If he fell for her and was honest, he'd lose everything. If he fell for her and lied, he'd become the one thing she despised. "This is impossible," he breathed, looking up at her. "It's a punishment for having a heart." "It's a safeguard," she corrected, her voice cold as steel. "I don't deal in emotional variables, Mr. Chen. This is business. My terms are absolute." He looked at her face, a mask of cool, detached control. Then he thought of his sister, of her tired, worried face, of the bills that kept him awake at night. He had no choice. With a trembling finger, He pressed the digital signature line. His name appeared in crisp electronic script. The word accepted glowed on the screen. He'd just agreed to the most dangerous game of his life, a game where the price of falling in love was ruin. The move to Helena's penthouse was surreal. One day, Marcus was living in a cramped apartment that smelled of instant ramen. The next, he was inhabiting a silent minimalist fortress of glass and steel that floated above the city. Helena greeted him not at the door but in the massive living room, her posture severe and unyielding. "Welcome, Mr. Chin," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. "Your quarters are in the East Wing." She led him down a long corridor to a suite of rooms larger than his entire apartment. They were beautiful, luxurious, and completely impersonal. "My own suite is in the West Wing," she stated, pausing at his doorway. Physical distance maintains emotional clarity. Remember the clause. The reminder was a slap, a cold splash ensuring he never forgot the rules. His first official duty as Mr. Ashford was a fundraising dinner held 2 nights later. A team of stylists descended upon him. They sculpted him into someone he didn't recognize in the mirror: fitted tuxedo, perfect grooming, expensive cologne. When he emerged, Helena was waiting. She wore a stunning midnight blue gown, looking impossibly beautiful. She assessed him with clinical precision. "Acceptable," she said, the single word delivered with the warmth of a lab report. But as she escorted him to the car, her hand resting on his arm, he felt a subtle tremor in her fingers. The contact, meant for the driver's benefit, was a jolt betraying her cool facade. At the event, she was a master performer. She was the devoted, charming wife, her hand always on him, her smile dazzling. She would lean in to whisper observations in his ear, her breath warm against his skin, making him shiver. She would touch his hand, his shoulder, his back. Each touch perfectly executed yet sending confusing jolts through him. Their performance was flawless, so convincing even they seemed lost in it. The most difficult moment came when her father approached, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Well, Helena," he said, his gaze raking over Marcus. "You certainly kept this quiet." "Marcus is the best decision I've ever made," Helena replied smoothly, pulling Marcus closer and pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. The gesture was for her father's benefit. But her lips were soft, her touch gentle, and for a fraction of a second, Marcus's eyes fluttered shut. He felt something, a genuine, undeniable spark. And he knew she'd felt it too. The ride back was thick with unspoken tension. The air crackled with the ghost of that near-intimate moment. They stood in the silent living room, city lights glittering below. "You performed well tonight," Helena said, her voice strained. She wouldn't look at him. "You too," he replied quietly. Heavy silence fell. They were both thinking the same thing. The kiss on the cheek, the way he'd leaned into her touch, the look in her eyes when she pulled away. It had felt too real. She cleared her throat, stepping back, physically re-establishing distance. "Good night, Marcus," she said abruptly, her voice cool and formal. She turned and retreated to her wing. "Good night, Helena," he whispered to the empty room. The denial had begun. They'd both felt the first dangerous spark, and they both knew that admitting it would mean the end. The stress of the double life began taking its toll. A week after the dinner, Marcus woke with a scratchy throat and pounding headache. He dismissed it as exhaustion, taking painkillers and forcing a smile. He couldn't show weakness. By midday, the headache was a drum behind his eyes, and feverish chills crept through his body. He felt dizzy and weak but pushed through. They were at a hospital board luncheon when it happened. He was listening to the CFO discuss budget allocations when the room suddenly tilted, the edges of his vision darkening. He swayed, reaching out to steady himself. Helena, who'd been across the room, saw it instantly. Her head snapped up, her clinical gaze zeroing in with laser focus. She saw his pale face, the tremor in his hand, the sweat on his brow. In a move that stunned the room, she abruptly cut off her conversation, strode across the hall, and took him by the arm. "Excuse us," she announced, her voice firm. "My husband isn't feeling well. We're leaving." She didn't wait for a response. She guided him out, her hand a steady presence on his back, ignoring the whispers. I'm fine, he protested weakly in the elevator. You're not fine, she countered. She placed the back of her hand against his forehead, her touch surprisingly gentle. You have a fever. You're going home. To bed. It was an order delivered with full authority. Back at the penthouse, she didn't send him to his room. She followed him. Get into bed, she instructed. I'll be right back. She returned with a thermometer, medication, and water. She took his temperature with practiced efficiency, her expression grim. 102, it's influenza, she diagnosed. You've been running yourself ragged. For the rest of the day, she became his reluctant, hyper-efficient caretaker. She canceled her afternoon surgeries, a move he knew was unprecedented. She brought him soup made from scratch. She ensured he was hydrated, that he took medication on schedule. She was brusque, clinical, but her actions spoke volumes. Her worry was tangible. That night the fever spiked. He drifted in and out of restless sleep, plagued by disjointed dreams. At one point he felt a cool hand on his forehead and whimpered. It's all right, a low voice murmured from the darkness. Just the fever. He cracked his eyes open to see Helena sitting in the chair beside his bed, a dim lamp casting shadows. You're still here, he mumbled, voice thick with sleep. I'm here, she confirmed softly. She reached out to check his temperature again, her hand cool on his hot skin. As her hand rested on his forehead, her thumb, in a slow, unconscious gesture, stroked his temple. It was a simple, soothing motion. Pure, unthinking tenderness. It was not the action of a doctor with a patient or a woman fulfilling a contract. It was genuine care. She seemed to realize what she was doing at the same moment he did. She snatched her hand back as if burned, shock and self-reproach flashing across her face. She stared at her own hand, then at him, her jaw tight with sudden fierce irritation, directed entirely at herself. She'd broken her own cardinal rule. She'd allowed emotion into the equation. Without another word, she stood and walked out, leaving him alone in the darkness, his skin still tingling from her touch. She was terrified, he realized. Not of him or the flu, but of the undeniable truth that her own heart was betraying her. After Marcus recovered, a new, fragile tension settled between them. Helena's act of care and subsequent retreat had been a silent confession. They both knew she'd felt something, and they both knew they couldn't discuss it. They tiptoed around each other, their conversations painfully polite, their interactions meticulously professional, each desperately trying to reinforce the crumbling walls of their contract. The universe, however, had other plans. We have to go to Vienna, Helena announced one evening, her tone brusque, her eyes fixed on a medical journal. There's a cardiac conference at the Vienna General Hospital. I'm the keynote speaker. As my devoted husband, your presence is expected. We leave Friday. The thought of being trapped with her for 3 days in one of the world's most romantic cities was both terrifying and exhilarating. Vienna was breathtaking, but for Marcus and Helena, it was a beautiful, sun-drenched torture chamber. To maintain their public image, they were forced into constant performative intimacy that felt dangerously real. They had to share a suite, separate bedrooms, of course, but a shared living space. They had to walk arm in arm through cobblestone streets, posing for pictures for the hospital's publicity team. On their first afternoon, they were instructed to get romantic shots. They found themselves standing on the Ringstrasse, a photographer directing them. Closer, the photographer called. Dr. Ashford, put your arm around him. Mr. Chin, look at her like you adore her. Helena's arm felt like a brand around his waist. Marcus forced a smile, looking up at her, and was startled by the look in her eyes. She was looking down at him not with cool detachment but with raw, unguarded intensity that made his breath catch. Perfect, the photographer shouted. Later, they bought coffee and pastries and sat on the steps of a plaza, warm sun on their faces. For a moment, they forgot they were performing. They talked, really talked, about the architecture, the history, the beauty of the city. She told him about a summer she'd spent here as a resident, and he told her about his dream of one day traveling through Europe. They laughed at a joke she made, a real shared laugh that echoed in the sunlit square. It was easy, natural, terrifying. The breaking point came on their last night. After the conference's formal dinner, they decided to walk back to the hotel, the air warm and scented with linden blossoms. They wandered through quiet, winding streets, their footsteps echoing on ancient stones. They stumbled upon a small hidden courtyard where a lone cellist was playing a hauntingly beautiful melody. A few other couples were scattered around, wrapped up in each other. Marcus and Helena stopped, drawn in by the music. They stood in the soft glow of old street lamps, not speaking, just listening. The music swelled, a melody of longing and love, filling the space between them, saying everything they couldn't. In the middle of the small crowd under the Austrian moon, she turned to look at him. The world around them melted away. There were no cameras, no colleagues, no contract. Only the music, the moonlight, and the undeniable truth in her eyes. She saw him. Not Mr. Chin, her contractual husband, not the nurse from the hospital. She saw Marcus, the man who'd made her laugh over coffee, the man she'd cared for when he was sick. Slowly, inevitably, she began to lean in. The desire in her eyes was clear, unambiguous. Her lips were inches from his. This was it. The moment that would end everything. The kiss they'd been dreading and secretly craving. And then, at the exact same instant, they both flinched back as if electrocuted. Panic flashed in their eyes, the shared, terrifying realization of what they'd almost done. They'd almost broken the contract. They'd almost chosen a moment of truth over a year of security. "It's getting late," she said, her voice strained. "Yes, we should go," he replied, breathless. They walked back in suffocating silence, a full foot of space between them. Each was trapped in private terror, horrified not by man-made rules but by the undeniable, uncontrollable laws of their own hearts. The flight back was a study in silent, agonizing tension. Marcus and Helena sat side by side, a chasm of unspoken words between them. The near kiss in the courtyard had shattered their fragile truce. Denial was no longer possible. They returned to the penthouse and their respective wings. The physical distance a welcome if inadequate shield. They avoided each other for 2 days, communicating only through terse professional text messages. The explosion came not from within but from the outside world. On the 3rd day, Marcus was scrolling through news on his tablet when a headline made his blood run cold. The Ice Queen's Truth, My Year with Dr. Heartless, by Jonathan Sterling. It was an exclusive excerpt from the tell-all memoir of Helena's ex-fiancé. With trembling hands, Marcus clicked the link. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. Jonathan painted Helena not just as a distant partner but as a cold, unfeeling machine. He twisted her dedication to her work into pathological obsession, her need for privacy into sinister secrecy, her quiet nature into cruel emotional withholding. He detailed fabricated arguments, twisted private moments, and portrayed himself as the loving, long-suffering victim of a woman incapable of human emotion. The article was a viral sensation. The comment section was a cesspool of vitriol directed at Helena. Marcus felt white-hot rage build in his chest. It was a lie, all of it. The woman described was a caricature. She was not the woman who'd laughed with him in Vienna, or the woman who'd gently placed a cool hand on his forehead in the middle of the night. He found Helena in her study. The room was dark except for the glow of city lights. She was standing by the window, a glass of wine in her hand, staring into darkness, her posture rigid with pain that was almost a physical presence. "Helena," he said softly from the doorway. She didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Go to your room." "I read the article," he said, ignoring her command and walking into the room. "It's all lies." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Is it? A cold, unfeeling woman who uses contracts to manage relationships? Sounds accurate, doesn't it?" "No," he said firmly. He walked over and gently took the wine glass from her hand, placing it on the desk. "He doesn't deserve your pain, Helena. He's not worth it." She finally turned to look at him, and the raw, unguarded agony in her eyes made his heart ache. The carefully constructed walls had crumbled, leaving only a woman who was deeply, profoundly wounded. "And what do you know about it?" she asked, voice thick with bitterness. What do you know about what I deserve? I know, he said, his voice softening, that the woman he describes isn't the woman who took care of me when I was sick. She's not the woman who made me laugh in Vienna. She's not the woman I see right now. His fierce, unexpected loyalty, his unwavering defense of her in the face of her own self-doubt, was the one thing she wasn't prepared for. It broke through the last of her defenses. The pain, the humiliation, the loneliness, it all coalesced into a single desperate, overwhelming need. With a low sound that came from the depths of her soul, she pulled him to her. Her hands framed his face, her mouth crashing down on his. It was not a kiss of tenderness or seduction. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of a drowning woman clinging to her only lifeline. It was raw, hungry, and utterly consuming, a desperate attempt to blot out the pain of the past with the undeniable, breathtaking reality of the present. Marcus met her desperation with his own, his arms wrapping around her, his body melting against hers. This was it, the truth, the inevitable, catastrophic, beautiful truth. The kiss finally ended. They pulled apart, breathless, their foreheads resting together. They stared into each other's eyes, the air crackling with the aftershock of what they'd just done. The horror of their action dawned on them both at the same moment. They'd just, in the most undeniable way possible, broken the contract. It was over. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by their ragged breathing. The kiss had been a confession, an admission of everything they'd been fighting desperately to deny. The game was over. The rules had been broken. Helena was the first to pull away, stumbling back as if physically struck. She stared at him, her face a mask of horror and self-loathing. I kissed you, she said, her voice hollow. She was a doctor diagnosing a fatal wound. I felt attachment. She walked to her desk, her movements stiff, robotic. She was no longer the passionate, desperate woman who'd kissed him. She was Dr. Helena Ashford, the woman of logic, of rules. And she was about to enforce the most painful rule she'd ever written. According to Article 11 of our agreement, she recited, the words sounding like a death sentence, the contract is now terminated. She sat in her chair, her back ramrod straight, and began typing on her computer. She was preparing the final fund transfer, the severance papers. She was following her own protocol, even as it clearly destroyed her. She was amputating the limb to save the body, cutting him out of her life to preserve the cold, empty order she'd built. Marcus watched her, his heart shattering. She was going to do it. She was actually going to let him go, to push him away, all because of a stupid, impossible clause she'd created to protect a heart that was already clearly broken. A fire born of love and fierce, desperate anger ignited in his soul. He would not let her do this. He would not let her hide behind her own walls. Wait, he said, his voice trembling but firm. She didn't look up from her screen. The terms are clear, Marcus. I broke the clause. The consequences are automatic. Then you're a fool, he shot back, walking to her desk and standing before her, forcing her to look at him. She finally raised her eyes, and the pain in them stole his breath. If we're going to be honest, he said, his voice ringing with newfound strength. If we're going to invoke the one clause that demands truth, then let's be completely honest. He took a deep, steadying breath. You weren't the only one who broke the contract, Helena, he confessed, his gaze unwavering. I broke it too. Weeks ago. Maybe even the first night at the gala. I fell in love with you. I am in love with you. His confession hung in the air, a stunning, beautiful countermove. She stared at him, utterly speechless. She'd prepared for every contingency, every variable, except this one. The impossible clause had created an impossible impasse. She'd broken the rule, so she was obligated to end the contract. But he'd broken it too. If they were both in breach, who had the right to enforce the penalty? The very rule designed to keep them apart now bound them together in their shared, mutual guilt. So what now, Helena? He asked softly, a challenge in his eyes. You can't fire me for breaking a rule you broke yourself. You can't enforce a penalty on me that you also deserve. Your perfect, logical, emotion-proof contract. It has a loophole. She looked from his defiant, loving face to the termination papers on her screen. Her entire world, built on rules and control, had just been turned upside down by the one variable she'd refused to entertain. She was a genius, a master of logic. But in that moment, faced with the beautiful, illogical, undeniable truth of their shared love, she had absolutely no idea what to do. The mutual confession left them in an impossible suspended state. The contract was broken, yet it couldn't be enforced. They were bound by the very rule that should have torn them apart. The air in the penthouse, once charged with unspoken tension, was now thick with an agonizing spoken truth they had no idea how to navigate. They spent the next 2 days as ghosts in the magnificent apartment, avoiding each other, lost in confused thoughts. The foundation of their relationship, the contract, was gone, and they were free-falling without a net. Finally, it was Marcus who broke the silence. He found Helena in her study, staring out the window, looking as lost as he felt. "I have to go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't stay here like this, Helena. Not in this limbo. The contract is broken. The reason I'm here is gone. I need to think. I need space." She turned to face him, her expression etched with pain mirroring his own. She wanted to argue, to tell him to stay, but she had no right. She was the one who'd written the rules. "I understand," she said, her voice rough. Leaving the penthouse felt like tearing part of himself away. He returned to his modest apartment, which his sister had been maintaining. The debts were gone. His sister's health was secure. The practical reasons for the contract were fulfilled. But his life, which should have felt free and unburdened, now felt empty, colorless. The silence in his small apartment was a hollow ache, a stark contrast to the charged, meaningful silence he'd shared with Helena. Helena, meanwhile, drifted in her own cold, empty fortress. The penthouse, once her sanctuary of order and control, was now a monument to her failure. His absence was a physical presence, a void in every room. She would walk past his door and feel a pang of loss so sharp it was like a physical blow. She'd built a world to protect herself from emotion, and now she was drowning in it. She'd lost. She'd tried to control love, and love had shattered her perfect, logical world. A week after Marcus left, her father, Richard Ashford, arrived at the penthouse for their scheduled weekly dinner. He found her in her study, a glass of wine in hand, staring at a blank wall. The house was immaculate but felt dead. "Good God, Helena," he said, his sharp eyes taking in her disheveled appearance, the emptiness in her eyes. "You look terrible. Where is that man? The chin fellow?" "He's gone," Helena said, her voice flat. "Gone? What do you mean gone? I was just beginning to respect him. He had backbone. Unlike that pretentious Sterling character." Richard sniffed, his disapproval of her previous relationships still potent. "What did you do?" Helena, for the first time in her life, told her father the complete truth. She told him about the contract, the impossible clause, the kiss, the mutual confession, and Marcus's departure. Richard listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. She expected a lecture about the folly of getting involved with someone from a different world. Instead, he let out an exasperated sigh. "You, my daughter," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "are a brilliant, brilliant fool." He stood and walked over to her. "You create a ridiculous self-sabotaging rule to protect yourself from getting hurt. And when you finally find a man with the strength and character to actually break through it, you let him walk away because of it. Of all the foolish, illogical things you've ever done, this is by far the most stupid." Helena stared at him, stunned. Her father, the formidable patriarch who'd orchestrated her social life with an iron fist, the man who'd pushed her toward appropriate matches, was taking Marcus's side. He patted her shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. "I don't know what ridiculous agreement you two had, but I know what I saw. That man looks at you like you hung the stars. And you, my daughter, haven't looked this alive, this human, since before your mother died. Now stop moping and go fix the mess you made." With that, he turned and left her alone in the study. His words, the most unexpected blessing, the most surprising validation, were like a key turning in a lock she didn't know was there. A few minutes later, Richard, from the privacy of his car, made a phone call. "Marcus, my boy," he said, his voice warm and conspiratorial. "It's Richard Ashford. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm calling because my daughter is being an idiot, and I believe you're the only one who can fix her." Richard's phone call left Marcus stunned. The man he'd viewed as a formidable, judgmental obstacle had just become his most unlikely ally. The conversation was brief, but Richard's message was clear. "My daughter is miserable without you. Go get her." But Marcus knew it wasn't his move to make. He'd confessed his feelings. He'd shown her his heart. The next step, if there was to be one, had to come from her. She had to be the one to choose to break her own rules, to step out of her fortress of logic and into the messy, unpredictable world of real emotion. Meanwhile, Helena was undone. Her father's words had stripped away her last defense, the cold, hard logic of the contract. She'd followed her own rules to the letter, and they'd led her to this empty, silent hell. She'd won the battle for control but lost the war for happiness. She thought about Marcus. She thought about his fierce loyalty when her ex-fiancé's book was released. She thought about his laughter in Vienna. She thought about the look in his eyes when he'd confessed his love for her, a look of such raw, terrifying honesty. She realized that her entire life had been about mitigating risk, controlling variables, protecting herself. But the greatest risk, she now understood, was not in loving and getting hurt. The greatest risk was in never loving at all. She couldn't stand the silence of the penthouse for another second. She grabbed her car keys and drove with no destination in mind. She found herself an hour later parked across the street from the small, unassuming community center where Marcus volunteered on weekends, teaching health education to underserved families. She watched through the window. He was inside, demonstrating CPR on a practice dummy to a group of attentive teenagers. He looked passionate, engaged, completely in his element. He looked beautiful and vibrant and completely out of her reach. For a long moment, she just sat there, her heart pounding. She was terrified. She, Dr. Helena Ashford, who could hold a human heart in her hands without a tremor, was terrified of walking across the street and speaking to a nurse. Taking a deep breath, she got out of the car. The class had just ended when she walked in. Marcus looked up, and his eyes widened in surprise. The teenagers filed out, giving curious glances to the elegant woman in designer clothes standing in their modest community center. Helena walked to him. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him, taking in the sight of him, memorizing the warmth in his brown eyes, the gentle curve of his mouth. "You were right," she said finally, her voice raw and quiet. "I was a fool. I built a fortress of ice around myself to protect me from a pain that happened years ago, and I didn't even realize I was freezing to death inside it." She reached out, her hand hovering over his, not daring to touch him without permission. "And then you came along. You didn't try to break down the walls. You just brought so much warmth and light that you melted them from the inside out. I'm terrified, Marcus. I'm terrified of feeling this much for someone. But I've learned in the last week that I'm much more terrified of the thought of living the rest of my life without you." She pulled an envelope from her purse. It wasn't a contract. It was a set of documents, irrevocable trust papers for his sister's lifetime medical care, the deed to a small house in a good neighborhood for his family, and a check for a sum that would ensure financial security. "You're free, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion she no longer tried to hide. "Truly free. The trust for your sister's care is permanent and unconditional. It's secured for her lifetime, no matter what. You don't owe me anything. You can take these, walk away, build any life you want, and I will never bother you again." She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "But I hope," she whispered, her voice breaking, "that you choose to stay. I hope you choose me." She placed the envelope on the table beside him. She didn't wait for his answer. She couldn't. She had laid her heart, her hope, and her vulnerability before him. She had given him the ultimate choice with no strings, no clauses, no conditions. She turned to walk out of the community center, leaving him alone with the papers and the unspoken question of whether his future was still with her. "Helena, wait." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned slowly, afraid to hope. He was standing there, the envelope still unopened on the table behind him. He hadn't even looked at it. "Do you remember what you said to me at the gala?" he asked softly. "You said, 'I'll make it worth your while.'" She nodded, unable to speak. "Well, you were wrong," he said, walking toward her. "Because nothing you could give me, no money, no house, no security, is worth anything if you're not part of it." He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I don't need your money, Helena. I don't need your connections or your resources." He reached up and gently cupped her face in his hands. "I just need you. The woman who stayed by my bedside when I was sick. The woman who laughed with me in Vienna. The woman who's standing here right now, scared out of her mind but brave enough to try anyway." Tears streamed down Helena's face, the first tears she'd allowed herself in years. "I choose you," he whispered. "I will always choose you." And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss born of desperation or performance. It was a kiss of homecoming, of promise, of a future they would write together with no rules except the ones their hearts demanded. When they finally pulled apart, Helena was laughing through her tears. "I need to tell you something," she said, resting her forehead against his. "I deleted the contract. Every copy. I destroyed it the day after you left." "Good," Marcus said with a smile. "Because I have a new contract to propose." He pulled out his phone and opened a note. On it, he had written a single sentence. "Party A, Marcus, and Party B, Helena, hereby agree to break the emotional attachment termination clause joyfully and with extreme prejudice every single day for the rest of their lives." Helena laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "This is the best contract I've ever seen," she said. "Shall we make it official?" he asked. She pulled him close and kissed him again, sealing their new agreement. Not with signatures or witnesses, but with the most binding contract of all, two hearts choosing, freely and without conditions, to belong to each other. 1 year later, Marcus stood in the same community center where Helena had found him that day. But this time, it was decorated with flowers and filled with their closest friends and family. Their wedding was an intimate, beautiful affair. Marcus's sister, her face glowing with health, sat in the front row, weeping openly. Richard Ashford sat beside her, patting her hand in a gesture of shared pride, a genuine smile on his face. As Helena walked down the aisle, no designer gown, just a simple elegant dress she'd chosen herself, she only had eyes for Marcus. He stood waiting for her, not with cool detachment, but with an open, adoring expression that was meant only for her. The love in his eyes was a tangible force, a warm, brilliant light. Their vows were simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal, filled with inside jokes and promises that held the weight of their unique journey. Later at the reception, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the happy guests, Marcus pulled her away for a quiet moment. They stood by the window, looking out at the city below. "I have something for you," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded cocktail napkin from the hotel bar where their journey had begun. "Our final contract," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it. On it, in her own sharp handwriting, were the words they'd written together. The final clause, "Party A, Marcus, and Party B, Helena, hereby agree to break the emotional attachment termination clause joyfully and with extreme prejudice every single day for the rest of their lives." Below it were both their signatures. Helena laughed, the sound echoing with pure joy. "Binding for a lifetime," she said, her voice full of love so deep it was bottomless. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss that held all the promises of their future. Their story had started with a lie whispered in a crowded room, a game of pretend with impossible rules. But it had ended here, with a truth written on a napkin. A testament to the beautiful, undeniable fact that the best rules are the ones that are broken by love. And that sometimes, the most logical thing you can do is follow your heart.